Review Committee. First item on the agenda is approval of minutes for August 10th and September 4th, 2021.
So moved.
Second?
Moved and seconded to approve the minutes. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Approved. So, tonight we are being visited by our town administrator, Joe Powers, and kind of looking for an overview of charter relative to your job, relative to what you see as a whole, things that you might feel could be better, or things that are not working. And if you want to just take it and go, I know you're fully capable.
So, excuse me, thank you, good evening. And I went to the wrong room. Old habits die hard. As a former member of this bylaw charter review committee, I went to the downstairs room because that's where we used to meet. And it's great to be in front of you. First of all, to have you folks back in action. As you may know, I was pleading with the Board of Selectmen to have this committee reconstituted because I know the value of the committee having served on it. And I can tell you that an administrator needs a committee like this to help with the questions that you've asked me about and want to talk about this evening. So first, thank you. Secondly, how much time you got?
As much as you need.
All right.
I mean, we don't want to be here at midnight.
I understand, neither do I.
No.
And that would be back-to-back late nights, and I understand that there's a playoff game that we might want to be tied into, those of us that enjoy the Boston
What
Red Sox,
time?
that is. Later, if we have time.
Okay.
I do have your agenda. I do have my blue book that I rely upon heavily. And I guess I would answer your question or invitation with a question right back to the group, meaning, as I've said before, I'm fully aware of what you folks do and the important role that you have here in the town, and I rely upon reference to the charter daily, and many times throughout the day. And so I come across different things, whether it's chapter 4 that relates to the town administrator. To me, the second one that I rely upon is chapter 5, town administration organization. And I often come across something that I'll read one section and I'll think I have an interpretation that I can work with, and then I'll read another section and I think it may have negated it. In a moment, I'm going to give you a specific, if I could, because it relates to town administrator, and if I remember how we say this, it would be, I think it's clause 431. Sorry, close, section 4. But then within section 4, so under chapter 4, town administrator, section 4, responsibilities for appointments. And then as I understand it, 4-1 is referred to as clause, and 4-4-2. So we have those two, but before I get into it, what I've looked at often, since my official appointment on February 1st of this year, but certainly acting as the interim administrator for a longer period before that, I've often sought the direction of section 3 of the duties of the administrator, because to me that section is very well articulated and very well laid out. In fact, if you go through that clause 432 and you see the sub-clauses that are there, one of the two of the ones that I draw upon are item H, which is in the absence of a personnel director, the administrator shall be responsible for the day-to-day administration of the personnel system and the personnel bylaw. And the second one after that, item I, which articulates clearly to me procurement. And I say clearly because it is good enough to make reference to the exceptions. So we know, and I don't say this just with our library director here, or if our water wastewater superintendent were here, but I'm mindful of the fact that the Board of Library Trustees, an elected body, while not the employer, because the town, through the Board of Selectmen, is the employer, but they have administrative responsibility over our library director, and therefore they have the right of their own procurement. And so, to me, again, this section I think is very well articulated, and it lays out quite nicely the things that I have to do, and should do. If you juxtapose that then with section 4, responsibilities for appointments. So I've told you that under the first section, under duties, I rely upon that statement of personnel administrator and the lack of a director. As you can imagine, an inordinate amount of my time, rightfully so, is spent on personnel matters and employment matters. When we go to town meeting, we hear that, most of our costs for the operating budget are derived from anywhere from, say, 73 to 78% of personnel costs. So personnel, as it is in the budget, is also a big part of my job. And so I've had questions with the board, and I look at section 4, clauses 441 and 442, and in fact, it's so important that I've blown those sections up on a Word document on 11 by 17 paper, and it's posted in my office and the Assistant Town Administrator's office. So we rely upon it daily. But when I read it, I think there's, let me strike that and say, I know, for me, there's a disconnect in what may be either an inconsistency or where one clause seems to negate or oppose the other clause.
Okay.
And so for me, that's why we have a bylaw charter review committee, first to bring that issue up and say, well, how do you read it? But then also, if we agree that there may need to be some wordsmithing, I'd rely upon this group to help with the effort that will go to town meeting and to town voters to change the charter.
Just section 4, Joe, right?
To start,
Okay.
chapter 4, section 4, clauses 441 and 442, because you
Yep.
can see there, so there's a 443.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And to me, that's very clear. It says that the town administrator appoints the harbor master and the assistant harbor master.
Right.
But when you get into those two items, on the one hand, it talks about that whatever the administrator does requires an affirmative vote of 3 or more members of the board of selectmen.
Mhm.
And it gives a very broad description of which appointments require that quantum of vote. And then you look at 442, and it has similar language, meaning as accepted as may otherwise be provided by, general law, bylaw, this charter, or something else. It talks about the administrator in both instances shall have the power to appoint.
Mhm.
But in that one, it talks about any such appointments under 442 can only be overturned by 4 affirmative votes of the board. So the first section says I need 3 votes to affirm, and the second one says I need 4 votes to overturn me, or there needs to be 4 votes to overrule me.
this has caused some problems over the years.
All right, so thank you,
Yeah.
Madam Chair. If I may,
Mhm.
it's not just me,
No,
thank you. Because I've belabored with that fear that I was missing something.
no, there've been, I recall several heated discussions among selectmen at meetings as to when the clock stops.
And there's that part of it as well.
Mhm.
So not only just the quantum of vote to unwind something by the administrator, but that timeliness action of 14 days.
Mhm.
And, you know,
14 days from when exactly?
Yeah, and we've discovered, when I say we, I mean Board of Selectmen and me as administrator, that, 14 days does not necessarily neatly adhere to the board's schedule. And so then, would we want to contemplate a special meeting of the board to fall within or during that time frame? And then if we're doing that, we're really bringing attention to what may just be potentially here, if I can read to it real quickly, theoretically, a seasonal employee.
Mhm.
But to me, Chapter 4 says that these are the things the administrator must do. Chapter 4 says the administrator must manage personnel, which makes sense. And then within that, you manage the personnel, and you do that by appointments, and in some cases, if unfortunately necessary, firings. But it's inconsistent and incongruent to me. So whatever shall we do?
Any comments from Anita? No? Deb?
No, I agree with Joe. I mean,
Carol?
yeah, no, it's ambiguous.
What would you suggest the remedy?
So, I don't know that I would suggest the remedy now. And the reason why I say that is, while I am the administrator, and while I am a resident and voter and taxpayer of the town, I view my role, as the word suggests, as administrator. I am the administrative officer for the Board of Selectmen. So what I would suggest is, if this body agrees that we have an inconsistency that I can tell you is concerning to me, then I would want to, on my end, bring it to the board. Because that board appoints me and is gonna weigh in on it. That board could direct me to continue working with you folks on this issue. But as an administrator, I don't want to be the manager.
Correct.
I want to administer on behalf of the board.
Okay, so you go to your board first and have this conversation and then come back to us,
Yep,
or have the board come back to us, whichever, or both.
right.
Yeah,
But being able to articulate that this evening and having you folks say, yeah, we agree, there's an issue here, to me is liberating and helpful.
Okay.
I guess we can adjourn now.
The only thing I would add to that, when you're talking about it, all employees of appointed town agencies, you might want to just put in their committees and commissions. 'Cause I'm trying to establish a firmer line between committees and commissions, where people understand that to be. I mean, I understand it, but we talked about it at the last meeting, and I think that's something that needs to be further, you know.
History repeats. I think it was one of the first questions I asked as a newly minted member of the bylaw charter review back in, I think it was 2017. Because I was unfamiliar with the concept of agency as it relates to boards, committees, and commissions. And having lived in one town for a long time and not having that language, and in 2017, simply residing here and working somewhere else on Cape, I hadn't come across it there. And I do remember that we had a discussion,
did,
and I
yes.
looked to my colleagues that served with me then,
Yes.
where I think council had provided some either definition or expansion on what they perceived agency to be. But to your point, it's still not clear.
Right.
No.
And if it's not clear to us, it's not gonna be, not that there's ever a casual reader of the charter per se.
Yes.
But if there is such a thing, it's not gonna be clear to them either, so.
Okay.
So when we do the cleanup, we can address all of those
Yeah, I think
questions.
so.
Okay. You're on a roll.
All right, so, I'm not gonna go any, much deeper into my personal notes, if you will. It was important for me to talk about that section and clause that talks about my responsibilities, and then having the conversation about wordsmithing and agencies and things like that is helpful. I will tell you that I'm aware of, one action that if I'm remembering the timeline correctly, the town, and I would say it probably should have emanated from administration. But you may recall, I think before this committee went out of existence for a period of time, that we had a charter change where the Board of Water Commissioners is now understood to be the Board of Water / Commissioners, rather than ampersand, for one thing. But I don't see that we, the town, have ever, so we know that, and I'm looking at the clerk, right, that passed both town meeting and the town vote referendum. We, the town, haven't done our next step when you do that to update this document, the charter, but then all other governance documents, which would be general bylaws, and if there is reference, zoning bylaws, and then so on down the line when you look at the parliamentary table of proceedings. You know, we're talking about the charter, we're talking about the general bylaws, the zoning bylaws, rules, regulations, and policies, and so we need to do, I'm probably using this word wrong, but I'm not gonna stop because I've used it before. What I would say is either a wholesale or omnibus change to reflect the fact that we now have an elected authority known as the Board of Water and Wastewater Commissioners. Or Board of Water and Wastewater Commission.
Commission.
Thank you.
That's gonna
Yep,
correct you
yep,
with
absolutely. And by the way, I'm gonna throw it out there as a wash ashore, I'm not even talking about water and sewer yet. That's 5 years down the line from now. I will tell you that I didn't know what wastewater was when I moved here, and someone told me, well, it's what you might call sewer. And I said, probably snarkily and inappropriately, well, the covers say sewer. Thank you. So if you go out in our streets, even in Harwich, the covers say sewer,
They do.
but it's wastewater. So, things like that, meaning, you know, well, present company included, meaning me. I just talked about how I washed ashore 6 years ago. And folks that do that off Cape are familiar with a water and sewer department or sewer commissioners. And I think more importantly, the statutes still talk about sewer. So we recognize that when we say wastewater, we're trying to translate that into what the statute refers to sewer. And I'm gonna do a heavy pause on that one to let that one sink in before I do my breaking news through the Board of Selectmen. So I'm gonna purposely pause, have a drink of water, and wait for the
Breaking
committee.
Would we at some point want to then invite the wastewater commissioners and you and Dan Pelletier to talk about this at some future date?
Well, if I may, that might be better for the discussion if we want to use the word sewer in lieu of wastewater in the future.
Mm-hmm.
But to the administrative task that I mentioned before, in anticipation of perhaps either needing some action of town meeting to cause that to happen, I did reach out to council over a year ago in anticipation. When I say over a year ago, that would have been the annual town meeting that happened in September, outdoors, not to be confused with this year's annual town meeting, which happened in May, but was also outdoors. And asked the question, what would the cost be? And, you know, generally speaking, do we think? Because we have to go through that Scrivener's effort, which, and then kudos to our clerk, we have a great vendor in General Code and their system of E-Code 360, so the effort to do that may not be as onerous as it would be if everything were just paper-based, but we have it electronically, so we may be able to rely through the clerk's office on the vendor for an estimate of that. But there was no directive action of any of the votes that I can remember that told us to do that, and furthermore, that any reference, as lawyers would say, yada, 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 would be to the Board of Water, Wastewater Commissioners. So, council's response was, it can be a little bit pricey, and that depends upon the vendor relationship and, you know, how much of that we can do without any further action necessary. In other words, if it's an administrative change and council says it's allowed based on the understanding of the vote of the town, meaning it's the wishes of the town, that we know it to be the Board of Water, Wastewater Commissioners, then I think it's a simple but not cheap or fast process of working with the vendor. So that one, I can validate through council and report back to you folks on what we found, if you'd like that to happen, on the changes, just to reflect that vote of the town.
Well, let me know when you get all that and we can schedule it.
Excellent. So I'm contemplating doing that in case it requires either appropriation at town meeting in the spring, and yes, I'm gonna say it, it's 203 days away for our town meeting in the spring, not to be confused with the special town meeting in 13 days. But we're right there in the sweet spot of preparing for that annual town meeting, so this is the time for me to do that, to see if there's a cost element to that.
Okay. And what is your breaking news?
The breaking news is I informed the chair of the Board of Selectmen at our regular Tuesday meetings that I had an invitation and opportunity to come before this board this evening. And he has authorized me to let you know that the Board of Selectmen, very soon at a future meeting, will be taking up whether to have the article at town meeting that would cause the name Board of Selectmen to be changed to Select Board. So he did have, as you may know with the chairman, he at every meeting reaches out to his fellow members and asks if there's anything that they want to have at future meetings. And he was advised, I believe, after last night's meeting that at least one member wants to have that conversation. So the board will be having that conversation in the very near future. I indicated based on my response here tonight, and to me, whether a person agrees with that action or not, for me is irrelevant. It's just like we said with Board of Water, Wastewater Commissioners, if we're gonna do that change, the town should be mindful of the effect that it will have on all of our governing documents, so charter, general zoning, right on down the table of proceedings.
Well, anticipating this discussion and raised question the last time we met about the cost and the fact that it's kind of out there, I did do a little canoodling around internet and found an interesting article which I think helps with this cost question a little bit, at least generally. You want a copy, Joe? You probably
If
already.
you have an extra, sure.
Yeah, you probably already know that. But basically, it talks about other towns that have done this, and they say that the cost generally in a town that doesn't have much to change as opposed to a town that has the general code was between $1,000 and $8,000. So that's at least a
That's a
potential
ballpark.
answer to
Thank you
that.
for getting that in.
I try.
That's great.
But yes, if we're going to do water and wastewater and this goes through, then it's all going to be part of the cost of making those changes, plus whatever else we run into
Right.
along the way. Yeah.
Would these, all of these language changes then come into what Joe referred to as an omnibus article? Just one that would reflect all of them, or we have to have separate articles for each change?
I think in regard to something such as Board of Selectmen to Select Board,
That would be a standalone.
it would be a standalone article, and I guess what I'm getting to is, and I should have gone back to this, I meant no disrespect to any of the group's agents or staff that were responsible for those articles and questions that went before town meeting and the voters to change it. To me, it was a very simple oversight, if anything, and, it's easy to catch, meaning if the town's contemplating going from Board of Selectmen to Select Board, it's my understanding that it not only requires a vote of town meeting, but it's also appropriate to go before town meeting. Because we're impacting upon our charter, so that goes to
Yes.
the voters a year later.
Agree.
But we're also impacting upon bylaws, and so, I think council would craft the motion for town meeting and the anticipated ballot question to reflect, if not in the body of the motion or in the question, certainly in the explanation, and that further that, if adopted, the town would then take steps to ensure that all references to Board of Selectmen are herein changed and referred to as Select Board. And so that gives me enough direction to know that I'm gonna set money aside, and $1,000 to $8,000 on average for a $73 million municipal public corporation is nothing, let alone, the justice of the question. And then we just make sure that it's understood that those changes happen.
Okay.
And again, for me, for water, wastewater, I think we'll find from council, it was an unintentional oversight that has no bearing on the result, and it's an administrative change.
And your office would budget for that.
I think it's appropriate, correct, and I would budget for it. It tends to be, I don't intend for it to be a catch-all, but it is the line item that refers to other professional technical services. And so there is a line item under administration and the board, I think, for legal. To me, that's not what this is. It would be other professional technical services whereby the town clerk owns that vendor relationship with general code, and the administration can provide the funding for that project. And so it does not impact upon the clerk's budgeting, because that would be unfair in my opinion. It's not to put the clerk's budget in jeopardy. Why are you doing this? And it's administrative act.
Yeah, right. It's a good thing.
If I can jump over to something that I had, this is actually part of our discussion with you, is the question of providing the voters with the bylaw changes by mail. Households, residents, that when we have.
This is your item 2 under new business?
Yeah, this is part of our discussion with you, is that we have a requirement to mail these potential charter changes, the ones that appear on the ballot, out to the voters. And that's another item that's not going to be inexpensive.
I have one coming up in January that we're gonna have to get the bonus for the town election from last year, and then we're going to go to church and.
Can't quite hear you, Anita.
And
Yeah,
no different than the effort that we would have worked on for the ballot question related to water wastewater, correct? Yeah.
I do have a mailing that's gonna have to go out to the voters on all the charter changes that happened at last year's town meeting to be put on next year's 22 ballot.
Okay,
So the mailing has to be going out in January.
Okay.
And so I was going to be talking to administration on the cost of. that.
have we figured out whether it's voters or households?
It's voters,
Correct.
So each, if there are 4 voters in a household, they each get one.
correct. State, that's on the state law.
So we're talking potentially
Yeah. my
10 to
understanding-
11,000 mailings?
Yes.
And my understanding, as the clerk just said, I think it is state law. However, I think we may be able to impact upon the charter, and this is one of those topics for broad and general discussion in the future, that if we had a provision in our charter, where, because then, if memory serves correctly, in Wellfleet, for Wellfleet, it was every household with at least a voter. And so that way, we were able to send to a household,
Mhm.
and however many voters were there, they would rely upon the documentation sent.
That would cut down.
So I think if we
Yeah, that would
have it
cover it.
expressly stated in our charter, then we don't have to rely upon state law, but as the clerk has said, the absence of that, state law prevails, and they prevail to the broader distribution, which makes it more expensive.
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions on this?
Nope.
Anybody from our huge audience? No, you all good?
Did we take attendance, by the way, for,
I have it,
okay, good, thank you.
yeah. It was difficult, lengthy.
Real challenge.
That was another question we had talked about, is the overlap in committees and commissions and
Mhm.
agencies. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do, and with the risk of sounding like I'm trying to curry favor with our town clerk, I would start out by saying that Ellen Powell and administration has been working hand in glove, and I think very successfully, with our town clerk and her staff on, for the board's benefit and the town's benefit, of clearing up where we are with committee memberships, oaths of office, terms of, lengths of terms and things like that. And because of that, the board is now getting into more conversations about what you might consider either consolidations or expansions. For example, at their meeting, and I'll say it this way for future broadcast, on October 4th, last night, the board was contemplating expanding upon the Energy Committee's charge by incorporating the resolution from town meeting from 2 town meetings ago, I believe, to incorporate the need for discussion on climate change.
Okay.
And so there's an example where the board has comfort that the Energy Committee as constituted has been vetted and affirmed by the clerk's office that everything about it is correct, meaning the number of members and if there's vacancies and they're all sworn in and all that stuff, that they can then get into, okay, now that we know that that committee is set, let's talk about expanding it. And so the board has been able to do that again, and a plug for my own staff, Ellen Powell, and certainly before her, Danielle Delaney, but really a partnership with the clerk's office to clear that up. So now the board's willing to take on more substantive discussions about those committees, their charges, and whether consolidations or expansion are warranted. So I think you'll see more of that in the coming weeks and months ahead for sure.
Excellent.
That's good.
Okay,
Very
great.
good, yes.
Exactly what I wanted.
Yep.
So, last meeting, Carol suggested a municipal calendar with actual dates that people could refer to for the various benchmarks and deadlines for all of these lead-ups to town meeting. And because she suggested it, she got tasked with the job of creating one.
Yeah.
So I make no promises or guarantees.
Yeah, no good deed goes unpunished, right?
No, exactly. I did this under, with tons of interruptions, and I had a lot of meetings today. So this is an example of how to do it, perhaps. And just so that everybody's got it in front of them. Maybe I might have missed some. Some of them might be incorrect, but what I tried to do was take the actual calendar and the charter part
Yep.
and put it into some sort of form you could see. So,
People could go on the town website and actually look at and go, ah,
Right.
that's the date.
So anything in red is, financial, anything in green is a holiday, and anything in blue is whatever it is.
So I must react first by saying thank you,
You're very welcome.
and then by saying I'm sorry, because this is something that I'm required to do. And you've given me a great template to steal and work on, and you're not that far off. And so I will tell you that I just had an email exchange with the chair of the Capital Outlay Committee. So given that we have a special town meeting coming up in the middle of October, I've strayed away from the calendar, but to the overall point, the municipal calendar is absolutely critical, and it is the best way to inform everybody. So I love what you've done, and I need to pick your brain about how you made a fiscal year calendar, because I've struggled with that.
It was a template.
And I love that. I mean, you're absolutely right, it's July 1st to June 30th.
Right.
And so, again, the apology is that this is incumbent upon me to do,
Okay.
and I am deficit in that. I did inform the chair a few weeks ago that on October 25th, meaning we have concluded the special town meeting, and I will be bringing forward the calendar. A few things, though, if I can build off of that. And so, again, truly, thank you.
You're very welcome.
And
As
the
I say, it's a
apology.
template in Excel, so.
And I think the overall ethic, and if you're saying that you folks talked about it before, you're spot on, meaning this is a necessity. I would also argue it's a responsibility of administration, and we will have that this year as we have in years past. As I've progressed through acting administrator to, as I say, permanent, but I don't mean that, I mean under contract. Nothing is permanent in this world. I have an even deeper commitment to that process. And that's why at every meeting I go to, I try to find a way either smoothly or inelegantly to weave in how many days till annual town meeting. Because I meet with department heads, not to put my colleague on the spot, or my colleague on the spot, but they can bear out that every time I meet with department heads, I tell them how many days until town meeting. And that's because as a former moderator of representative town meeting elsewhere, and in our form of government, there is no entity greater, said the person who works for and is contracted by the Board of Selectmen, there is no entity greater than town meeting. And I make that clear because everything we, administration, Board of Selectmen, but certainly department heads with me and through me, everything we do culminates in town meeting. And as I tell folks that are unfamiliar with that form of government, town meeting only does two things, as you folks know. They only appropriate all the money, and they only ascribe all the laws. Other than that, they're not that busy. And of course, being facetious, but that's the whole ballgame. That's the whole ball of wax right there. Now, with this, I also want to talk about, you make reference to the 7-year capital plan. We now know that it is on a 5-year plan. And that's where I was trying to pick up from the work of the
Didn't we?
predecessor bylaw charter review, where I had read the materials and I understood that there was an effort to change that back in 19. And so it had gone before the town, and council has said it is in place, that we will do 5-year capital outlay going forward. And so the next capital outlay
Yeah, we
plan
discussed that. I
will be
remember that.
fiscal year 23 through 27. Now, the other part of that I put out there, and I would incorporate into my calendar, that is greatly influenced by Carol's, that's one thing, I stole parts of it, is I've also said to the board that the charter, quick editorial comment, interestingly to me, requires that the town administrator, not the board, not the finance committee, not the finance director, but under, and I think it's, I'm guessing here, but chapter 8 or 9, whatever the financial components are, it dictates that the administrator must create, and this is a word that I have on my time tracker on my whiteboard in my office, comprehensive budget and budget message. And so that's why I talk about our comprehensive budget. What's truly voted at town meeting last year was in the order of $73 million. Now, that's not the operating, that's not what the staff and departments do on wages, salary, wages, and expenses. That's about $39 million. So we do have a $39 million more or less operating budget. But the charter requires a comprehensive budget and budget message. And so that incorporates the other, I'm gonna do math poorly, almost,
Come on, Joe.
73 minus 39, 34 million or so, that creates the full.
The other half.
Thank you, I could have done that, but again, I'm not that eloquent with math. Point is, $73 million all in for fees and assessments to the state, to the county, obligations under health insurance, other post-employment benefits, so on and so forth. So, yep, 39 million for operating budget. A big component of that, as we know, is education, which is outside the purview of administration, but well within the purview of town meeting. And so it's my job, it's the administrator's job to build that. That's what it says in the charter. What it doesn't say is what the board has relied upon in past years, that I've been committed to and have been tasking and working with department heads to accomplish. And that is, we have what is perceived to be a new, for lack of a better phrase, 5-year capital outlay plan going forward, and this will be the first iteration of it. And the work that this predecessor committee had done to make sure that any amendments to that in the future require 2/3 vote. So it's that important to lock that in the first 5 years, in the preparation for the first 5 years. I've asked staff to look at their budget, not only for operations, not only for capital, but also community preservation, so that I can build a 5-year financial outlook for the Board of Selectmen. And so that's something that I'm presently working on, that I'm not ready to deliver yet and wouldn't deliver before a special town meeting, but comes to impact upon this calendar here. If I may, I'm probably bordering on, yep, I've already violated the town administrator to provide to the Board of Selectmen a financial assessment. And I say that because it's due today, and I agree with that calendar.
Yes.
I will be begging forgiveness until hopefully October 25th, when, having concluded special, can redirect our attention to town meeting, annual town meeting, but also to say, here's the financial outlook. Here's what we're looking at over the next 5 years. And so capital is at 5 years and becomes a component of it, but it's more than that. It's operational, it's community preservation, and it's other stuff.
It's, full,
Say again?
it's the full operation, yeah, the whole
Comprehensive,
deal.
as I would say, right. And the reason for that is, I need to be able to articulate first to the Board of Selectmen, and then through the Board of Selectmen, through the Finance Committee process, and any other boards and committees that have a role weighing in on articles, that this is the outlook. And we know that where we are in late fall 2021, or middle of fiscal year 22, and are envisioning fiscal year 23, that's gonna be much clearer and more focused and accurate of a picture, where fiscal year 27 isn't, but we shouldn't shy away from that planning. And so I will tell you that you may have heard me at board meetings talking about, and you'll see 2 articles at the special relate to this. We have 8 collective bargaining agreements with the 8 collective bargaining associations, so that's 8 union contracts, to say it informally. We have a 9th group that is personnel bylaws, which are those folks that aren't covered by a collective bargaining agreement, nor are they covered by what I and some of my colleagues in what I've labeled executive management are at, and that would be personal services contracts. So really, there's 10 groups. There's 8 of the unions, 9 personnel bylaws, and 10 executive management contracts. So the union agreements and the contracts tend to run on 3-year increments, 3-year cycles,
Yep.
which is common and standard for
Yes.
municipal government. The difference for Harwich, however, for an abundance of reasons, is that we had staggered schedules. But with negotiations, and a few years ago, going past the end date of the contracts, and then pandemic, we're now at a point where the town meeting approves the appropriation. We will have water, fire, So we will have 5 of the 8 contracts that are on one-year agreements. And that was intentional by me and administration and supported by the board, that they'll come due, they'll expire June 30th the coming year. They are fiscal year 22 agreements that expire on June 30th. And that's because they were either already up and we were in negotiations, or they were coming due and we entered into negotiations. And so I made the case to those groups that settled, I hate that word, but probably should say came to agreement, because that's really what happened between the town and the unions, where there is a, for lack of a better word, a benefit. Certainly for me as administrator building a comprehensive budget, to be able to envision the collective bargaining agreements being on the same schedule. Now that presumes that when all 5 expire, and the 3 that relate to police, patrolmen, dispatch, and superior officers, the fact is that the town has an obligation in January of 2022 to immediately start the renegotiation process for the 5 that are coming due in 6 months, or 5 months really. And then it already states in those contracts with the police that are ending their 3-year cycle on June 30th, 22, that if we, the town, don't initiate renegotiation in December, we must do it in January. So recognizing that these planets were starting to align in that manner, knowing that we had the capital outlay now coming into a 5-year frame, and understanding that past practice was for an administrator, certainly in partnership with the finance director, I would never deny myself the benefit of Carol's expertise and ability, but recognizing that the administrator is responsible to develop a 5-year plan. So now I know that fiscal year 23 could be impacted upon the successful conclusion and completion of 8 collective bargaining agreements. And then if we took that to its theoretical conclusion, we know that 3 years later, so fiscal year 23 to 24, 24 to 25, 25 to 26, I know what my financial outlook looks like in fiscal years 23 and 26.
Okay.
Heavily driven by personnel costs, which a million years ago when I started 15 minutes ago with my presentation, or longer for you folks, said that 73 to 78% of our costs are personnel. We know that that's going to be a major influencer on our budget deliberations and discussions, potentially for fiscal year 23, and if it holds for fiscal year 26. And so for me, building that financial outlook, I'd say, okay, well, those are the years that I may want to stay away from major budget busting projects if at all possible. So that's where fiscal year 24 might come into view. We might want to focus on, say, and this is all theoretical right now, but an expansion or a devotion, perhaps is a better word, to capital outlay. We may not be able to afford a major capital push in fiscal year 23 because of the impending personnel costs. But we may be able to have space and bandwidth to do that in 24 and 25. And we know 26 is impacted by unions, and we know the 5th year, 27, could be another capital-driven. And when I say capital-driven, I don't just mean capital outlay, but also the budget busters, wastewater, other post-employment benefits, affordable housing, those community impacting and life-changing topics. And so, the calendar supports that. And the calendar ties back to many of those which are required under charter. Some of the other things that I will add that aren't in the charter, but I think have equal importance because they're derived from other governance documents. Specifically in my regular conversations with Dr. Carpenter, with Monomoy as our major school player, and my regular conversations with Mr. Sanborn at Cape Tech, to a lesser degree, but still education costs. We know that the town, as a partner in Monomoy, has deadlines that we have to meet, but also that the school system has deadlines within the agreement. And so there is a reference in the Monomoy Regional Agreement whereby the school system, the district, has to provide information of a certain level to the boards in both Harwich and Chatham, and then to the Finance Committee. When I struggled as the interim administrator to try and figure out how my predecessor came up with his calendar, and that's not meant as a derogatory comment to my predecessor, I didn't have the benefit of a conversation. You know, he had built it in the way that he did, and I couldn't reverse engineer everything, well, because not everything was derived from charter.
Right.
And so there may be things that he elevated to a charter level of importance that I may do,
Right.
but I know that charter dictates all that it dictates, and it must be present in the calendar. But the regional school system agreement is a lesser but still important governance document with legal deadlines, and that should be reflected.
Sure.
And then, of course, last but by no means least, would be any reference in the bylaws if they're not already covered in the charter.
Right.
And then policies and regulations of the board and other committees. And so the calendar helps me crystallize that, keeps me on track, and also helps me talk at length, and I apologize, Madam Chair and members, I keep looking at the clock, and as my dad says, I can't say hello in less than 20 words, but I think important to put out there how the
Married to that.
Well, it's a,
5 years is an important number, comprehensive is a legitimate word, so on and so forth.
it's a great overview, and actually, anybody who's interested in why the charter matters ought to be watching this.
Yeah, really.
You have a question?
And just to add to that,
Anybody else,
Joe,
any question?
No, I just wanted to point out, the only reference that I did in here was the charter and perhaps, town holidays. That's,
Sure.
those are the only ones. that-
Holidays matter.
Holidays
It may impact,
matter.
as the clerk will tell us, it may impact on certain regulatory dates. but-
So those are the only dates that I tried to marry.
Yep.
Oh,
No, I think it's a wonderful document, and again, truly kudos for getting it done, and apologies that you folks knew it had to get done, because that is on me, so.
Well, we have to be worth something,
What
right?
is the date of the special town
Always
meeting?
demonstrating value.
Ray, any questions?
Yeah,
You're
special
set,
town-
Deb?
The
I have,
special
I
town
have,
meeting?
I have special town meetings, what, the 18th?
Yes.
13 days away,
I have,
13 days and an hour,
Uh-huh.
40 minutes.
I have two questions.
It's the 18th?
Yeah,
Yes, yep, 6:30 PM.
two questions. One, as far as the deadlines that are now contained in the charter, do they work for you generally under normal circumstances, or do you think there are some changes that need to happen?
Thank you. Generally, they do work. There are some that I've felt like there's crowding, for lack of a better word. And the good news is we have time, not tonight, I will spare you folks. But I would like to come back on several others. But I would ask you to look at the financial requirements, and again, somebody correct me, but I think we're talking chapter 9 of the charter. But
Yes.
some of it, when I read it, and you try to match it to a calendar, whether it was intentional or not, I think the month that comes into play is February. Well, what do we know about February? And next year is not a leap year,
Right.
Because it's not a presidential year.
Correct.
But what happens when
You
February?
complaining that it's short?
Correct. Yeah, that, there's a variability there that,
Mhm.
I don't think that it necessarily says February. But if you work backward from the date of our town meeting, which is ironclad,
Mhm.
you impact upon February. And so, I'm fumbling now because I came across it in preparation and was able to rely upon the pandemic meeting, where because of the exigency of the special laws that were passed, it wasn't an issue, but it's a concern generally. And then the other part of that, in dealing with this special town meeting, and I will offer, I said to the board last night, I think I self-report a little more than I should, but I'd rather self-report more than less
Yes,
and,
yes.
not be
I
found
agree.
out. I tell the story that, again, given my background in or town meeting, which is the predominance of my 30-plus years of municipal government is town meeting rather than mayor council. And it's a bad word, and I'm looking for help from my dear friend and former colleague when I was a clerk. I assumed that every town didn't necessarily do a fall special every year, like perhaps Brewster does or other towns. But we must have fall special town meetings, and given the things that are coming up on the collective bargaining agreements and wastewater and all these important things, I'm gonna start building the potential warrant this summer and get it to the board and work with the clerk. I wanna get it out there that I worked around her and the moderator's schedule, because that's the only reason, that's the only way you schedule a special. But never ask the question, what is our town's history on that? So when I started to develop the draft warrant, I went to our network drive to find past examples. And our network drive goes back about 13 years, and when I realized I couldn't find a special town meeting fall warrant, light dawned on Marblehead. We, Harwich, don't do those. So I apologize for backing into what we may not do regularly or informally.
Well, what you should know is that when the charter was originally written, it required a fall town meeting. And for many years, we had fall town meetings. And for whatever reason, the whole idea of a fall town meeting fell into some disfavor and eventually was eliminated.
But not prohibited,
No,
clearly.
Just
no, not at all.
eliminated. That's
Because it
right.
would be breaking news if on October 5th, 13 days before town meeting, if you were doing.
You're holding an
prohibited
illegal meeting?
activity.
Mm.
So thank you for that, because what I found is, as I do, I think not just because I'm a former town clerk and we're well-trained in that, as our colleague knows, but a good administrator is always gonna go to the good book, the governance book, the charter. And so I did rely upon that, and I didn't find references. I found references to town meeting, but then as I dug into it, it was understood or implied that it was to the annual. And so I couldn't find a comparable schedule mechanism or deadlines. I wanted to create a calendar for a special town meeting is what I'm trying to say. And I did find some things in the general bylaws. But if memory serves, the only thing I found in the charter says that, and I think it might be the actual language, but unlike the process and the calendar that's required for an annual, wherein the Board of Selectmen and Finance Committee must meet jointly, the expression for special is that they may not, cannot join jointly. And so when I was building the calendar, I had to be mindful that I had to get a draft warrant to the Board of Selectmen for them to populate it, to then share it with the Finance Committee, because there was some reference where they could not be jointly.
I don't think that's true.
It may not be, but my
The only
concern
thing
was that
that you might be referring to is that if there are articles with fiscal implications, the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee meeting separately, both have to agree to include the article.
Thank you. That is the reference, meaning every article that's in the special has a financial or fiscal implication. And so I thought, okay, wait a second, my minimal muscle memory, if you will, having done 2 abnormal annual town meetings, if I can call it that, being what it was, it struck me as different from the annual. And so when I read that, and I said, I know the articles that I'm creating, every single one of them has a financial implication or a fiscal implication, and therefore needed to be aware that the finance, so the selectmen would develop it in theory and say this is good enough to send to the Finance Committee. Finance Committee went through it, and then the next meeting of the board was to simply close it, so nothing else was added. But that was clunky, and I guess my overall observations are, there's nothing to guide an administrator or anyone else in town if we want to get into the, I won't say habit, I would say practice, because I will share with you that for my tenure, I would like to be able to rely upon a potential special town meeting every now and again. I will immediately put it out there that I would be loath to do a special town meeting in the falls that end in even-numbered years. And I'm looking for recognition from the town clerk, because I'm not going to impact upon her already busy electoral schedule. You want to shoehorn in a special between a state primary and a gubernatorial or worse, presidential, with the advent of early voting now, there's no time for a town clerk's office to drop what they're doing and focus
Right.
on a special.
Can I give you just a little bit of history?
Absolutely.
Back up, Sandy can attest to this, and I'm pretty sure Carol can also. History is that I believe when the charter came into effect, we had elections on Monday. Town meeting began Tuesday. Whatever was voted on Monday, new selectmen were voted in on Tuesday. Made it very difficult for the new members, no matter what board or even the town clerk would have been on, to step in and try to do the duties of, you know, someone who had been there before.
Sure.
Then what would happen, we would have town meeting, and then whatever town meeting voted on to be voted on a 2.5 override, we had another election in June.
Yeah, yeah.
So I believe that that's when we kind of stopped this and had the town meeting set the first Monday in May, and we knew what questions would be on the ballot.
Sure.
So we had the election on the third Tuesday.
God bless you.
That calendar preceded the charter.
Oh,
It had
that's
been that
right.
way for
Oh,
many,
sure.
many
I
years.
apologize.
So we
Right.
just, I think, basically immortalized it in the
Yeah, yeah,
charter.
Yeah,
But it was very counterintuitive to be a elected selectman one day and then be prepared to step into the role the next day
Sure.
when the
Yeah.
person who had gone through all the budget hearings and
Mhm.
all that
all the
was
institutional
gone.
knowledge, right, exactly.
was gone, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, so the change, this is a change. Your calendar, I would think, for a special wouldn't be any different than it would be for the special inside of a regular.
So, and thank you for that. You're absolutely spot on. However, in my brief and fractured tenure here, I can say that I have never participated in an annual town meeting that had a special within the annual.
They all do.
Well, the September outdoor and the May outdoor did not. But I also want to perhaps
Right.
give comfort to you folks in the viewing audience that I'm very familiar with that process in other town meeting towns. And I will, as I've said, that I want to be able to rely as an administrator on behalf of the board and of the town on special town meetings in the fall, usually in odd years if it's warranted. As I would argue, it is this year for what we have going on. And again, for me, they're warranted because of the impacts that we've had, of pandemic and everything else. It's impacted upon the ability to collectively bargain and so on and so forth. But that I fully anticipate and understand the value of having a special within an annual. And in fact, you know, there was a discussion earlier this fall with an article as it relates to salary increases. I won't relive the matter itself, but the question was, well, if we don't cover this group now, when we do it, and my answer was I was very comfortable with my response in that, oh, we just handle it at the special. Meaning, if you impact upon the present fiscal year, you can do it as late as May or June, certainly May preferred, and then as far as appropriations for wages or remuneration for staff, you earmark it as retroactive to July 1. So what do you do in May? You go through the bulk of your fiscal year, you know you have some other bills or obligations, and you cover that at the special in May, and you work towards closing out that fiscal year as you then go back into your annual to build your next fiscal year. And so that, I know, is not only a tradition, but a strong management practice here that I am aware of and understand and endorse, where I was otherwise blissfully ignorant of special town meetings in the fall. All of which I would ask as administrator still be available as administrative tools to get things done.
They do. Okay. My last question for tonight, and I've been looking for it, I can't, of course, put my hand right on the provision, but one of the provisions in the charter talks about all new personnel must go before town meeting. You familiar with that one?
I'm very familiar with it. It's under chapter 4.
Thank you.
Well, I'm gonna say, I believe it's under chapter 4, not chapter 5. And I will tell you that my familiarity causes me to have a slightly different interpretation or take on how the chair just approached it.
Well, I can give
but
you
it-
some history on that, too.
If I may,
Mhm.
it's section 5,
Yep.
so it follows
Oh, I
on
got it.
responsibility for appointments.
Mhm.
And so I do want to say that I do rely heavily on that responsibility of administrative reorganization. I think you'll know that as positions become vacant, and I certainly relied upon this during the impact of pandemic, meaning when in the early days, things were so dire, and none of us knew what the implications were gonna be. We, executive management, had to start contemplating drastic financial actions. And one of the things I said is, in my experience, I will say this generally, that layoffs don't achieve what we all think they would achieve in the municipal where they might in the private sector. But that the way that you want to make headway is when a position becomes vacant, and I'm probably using the word incorrectly, but you attrite it, or you don't fill it by attrition, and that allows us, if we have discipline over years, to save money. Well, I rely upon, anytime there's a vacancy, I have an obligation to analyze whether there's an opportunity for reorganization. Meaning we have an open position, is there an opportunity to combine it with something? Is there a way to reframe a job so that, not that we're necessarily saving money, but we're mindful of headcount. The more headcount we increase, the more those personnel costs go up, et cetera, et cetera. To the chair's question, I'm very cognizant of clause 452, because at present, I have not proceeded with the creation of any new, full-time positions, because I've been mindful that if I were to do that, and I'm gonna put my glasses back on because I don't wanna do this from memory, if memory serves correctly, it requires not only the approval of the board, but would have to go through finance committee to have an affirmative vote of town meeting. Meaning, my take on that is, it wouldn't just be that I incorporate into an operating budget an appropriation for that position. But rather, I understand this and am motivated to understand this to be that an article that calls for the creation of that new full-time compensated position be presented specifically and directly to town meeting. The words I focus on are new, comma, full-time, and I will just tell you that perhaps there will be spirited discussions amongst many parties in the future about that part of it.
Well, going back to original intent
Yep.
and how it was practiced in the beginning, that's exactly right. It was contemplated to be an article the town meeting would vote on. We want to hire a new full-time maintenance person. It would go to town meeting in an article with a recommendation from the finance committee. Over the years, there's been some slippage. And most recently, it seems that these new positions just got buried in a budget. And so I'm very happy to hear that you approach it this way. I think that might not be the worst idea to include some language in it so that that particular procedure carries forward into the future regardless of who's in the job.
Right. If I can, I wholeheartedly endorse that last statement, because, again, I've said it before tonight, and I've said it throughout my tenure. I am the administrative officer appointed by and directly responsible to the Board of Selectmen. But I don't do that in a vacuum. I have worked in municipal government for 33 years, and I have a deep and abiding respect for the New England, and I think beautifully Massachusetts form of government that is town meeting. Be it open or representative, if you think I can talk for hours on the charter, I can talk for days about the benefits and the direct detractions of representative and open and vice versa. But what I want you folks to take from this, and perhaps the viewers and anybody listening, is my deep and abiding respect and, to some degree, reverence for town meeting. Not all of us that populated as voters, or as I like to say, members, because whether you're a voter at an open town meeting or a representative town meeting, you're all members, you're part of the assembly. This is our form of government. This is the way that we as the royal we, all of you that come long before me and those that came long before you folks, this is our form of government. And so the charter is very explicit and very directive. And from my perspective and my benefit, I do injustice to the process, to the job, and to town meeting if I don't recognize the intent of that clause is to be open and transparent. And the quickest way for me to lose the benefit of the contract that I have is to be the opposite of that. And so I want you all to know that I read that document, I love that document, and it's not just because I sat where you folks now sit.
Thank you. Bob, do you have any questions? You've been listening.
No, just trying to learn more about this
Okay.
and the process and.
Well, I think everybody's learned a little something about various aspects that we might not have thought about or considered, and it's a great overview. Anybody have any questions?
I'm set, thank you.
All good?
Nice work, Joe.
Yeah, good session,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you. I
Very
would like
good.
to close by saying thank you. And I mean that sincerely, not just for what I said at the beginning. This committee, any bylaw charter review in any town is absolutely critical. You know, be it permanent, like this one is intended to be, or ad hoc. If a town doesn't have a mechanism to constantly review their governing documents, the town's not moving forward. And the residents and the voters aren't served. So I'm thrilled that this body, if you will, was reconstituted, and that you folks are here, and I'm truly appreciative of the invitation. I will work to never wear out that welcome. I won't hit you with both barrels, but I do look forward to conversations like this in the future, both short-term and long-term, because we are all in this together, and our town is based on our governance documents and none greater than our charter. So it really is a thrill to be back here tonight with you folks, and I thank you for that. Said the government geek here, I said it, and I'm not ashamed of it.
Like nice words about the charter too, because that's kind of my baby.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
Pam. It's necessary, it's important, and it works,
Well,
and it's vital.
I think for the most part it has. We've tweaked it and changed it and gone back and forth about a lot of things over the years, but I think essentially it's remained fairly true to its roots, and it has worked. Okay.
Well, thank you all again, and if I can say, go Red Sox.
There you go.
What time?
For the
I
game.
said, go Red Sox, that was off the record.
Oh,
No.
good heavens. That was only 40 minutes. You're good for more than that.
Yeah, that
Oh,
was,
that was an hour and 10
No,
minutes,
no,
wasn't
Exactly,
it?
am I dismissed?
You may go. Thank you.
Thanks so much,
again,
Joe.
Thank you.
folks. I
Appreciate it.
appreciate your time and your
Excellent, thank you.
willing to listen to that along.
No,
Thank you.
I think it was really helpful.
Yes, absolutely.
So, old business, anybody have anything that they'd like to take up as far as continuing research? Are we good for the time being?
I think so. I am.
Upcoming agendas? We have our next meeting,
Oh, we don't, do we have a?
I think, did we want to talk about, revisions to the committee handbook? That was something that, is your office working on that, or?
We could, I could.
Okay.
Right now, I'm working very closely with, like Mr. Powers had said, with Ellen Powell.
Mm-hmm.
And we're coming up with charges, or she's looking at, working with the Board of Selectmen to coming up with charges, because the charges should be mentioned in the committee handbook.
Okay,
So as soon as all of that takes place, I think we could probably look to maybe more update that committee
Okay.
handbook when we can get everything more in place.
right, because
Does that
I
make sense?
Yeah, I
still have
think
that stickler between
Yes.
committee and commission,
Wow.
that people understand the difference between the two.
Correct.
And some of them are elected, which is, that aren't always specified within that list of,
well, there may be other changes that come along too that would impact the committee handbook
Yes.
as we go forward in the next 6 or 8 months.
and we
Um,
talked about
but I
remote
would say-
participation being one of them.
Yeah, exactly. I would say keep looking at it, keep, looking back and forth at the
Mhm.
charter with it, and, at some point, we could have I think it's a discussion that probably should be taken up with the selectmen, since ultimately that is their purview. But we could compile some suggestions and what have you to talk to them about somewhere down the road.
Right, exactly.
But it definitely needs an overhaul.
Yeah, it
It
does.
definitely does. So, we have our next meeting,
We're usually meeting the second Tuesday, but
yeah,
for some reason we couldn't, because
I
I
think-
wasn't available.
I think we were, yeah, I think
I
we
have
all,
October, November 9th as the next meeting.
okay,
Does that work?
that would, works as far as I know. Okay, November 9th. I guess the question is, what would you like to see on the agenda for the next meeting? Was there another group you'd like to talk to? Do we want to sit and contemplate what we've heard tonight?
There was a lot in tonight.
There was a lot.
Lot to
There was a
absorb,
lot.
Yes.
Do you want to just give it some thought? Maybe I'm going to go back and watch this tape, probably twice. Think about what might come out of it and send me some suggestions over the next couple of weeks, so I can put together an agenda.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
that would
fine.
be great. All right, well, I think we're done.
Okay.
Motion to adjourn?
Is there a second? Moved and seconded to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
It is a vote. Thank you all. I think it was a great meeting.
6:11.
I do too.
Turn it off, Ray.